Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our February 2018 monthly webinar. Thank you all for joining us today for Considering the Intersections of Identity in Your Work with Catch the Next Scholar Mentor, Sarah Rodriguez. It is my great pleasure to introduce Sarah today, Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, whose research addresses issues of equity, access, and retention of Latino students in the higher education pipeline. She focuses on the intersections of race, ethnicity, and gender for STEM students and the role that community colleges play in creating equitable outcomes. Dr. Rodriguez has worked with the project Engaging Latino Studies for Transfer and College Completion, a national initiative at the Center for Community College Student Engagement focused on helping institutions strengthen Latino student engagement, transfer, and college completion. Rodriguez has served as a New Mathways Project Mentorship Program Coach for the Dana Center, and she has also been involved with the national initiative Improving Outcomes for Men of Color in Community Colleges at the Center for Community College Student Engagement, in addition to serving as a research coordinator for Project Males. Quite an impressive resume, and we are looking forward to hearing what she has to share with us today from this vast vita. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Rodriguez.
When I was asked to do this, I wanted something that was hopefully going to be helpful to you in two ways. So I really wanted to think about how we were considering the intersections of identity in the work that we do. So really trying to figure out how we take identity, how we think about this thing that is identity, and how we can really structure change. And not just small short-term change, but real cultural and structural change on the basis of really honoring these identities that the students are coming to us with. So in the session, the first thing that I'm going to do is share information related to understanding identity. So what I mean when I say identity, and how to honor that in our classrooms and in the work that we do. And the second part, I'm going to push you a little bit. So I hope you're ready. I hope you have your coffee for the afternoon. I want to challenge you to think about how these considerations of identity, of intersectionality, can really work towards creating more equitable outcomes. So the first part is understanding and honoring a multitude of identities. I think this is really important to honor all the identities that the students are coming to college with, because people are complex. I am, you are, and all of our students are complex as well. And really, our students are worthy of us appreciating that complexity and not relegating students to one particular identity or even two identities, but really seeing the student and the student experience as the result of several different identities that are coming into play. So in terms of identity, I wanted to set some kind of ideas about what it is and why identity is important. So I think identity is very important because it really is how one understands and positions oneself. So it's really about the thoughts that you have about yourself, and really a way that we can understand how individuals and groups interact with the world. It's also showing us how one becomes associated or alienated from the various communities that we interact with and the norms and cultures that are a part of those communities. So really understanding the interactions, between students or between students and faculty, and really pushing to understand not only who is a part of those communities, but really who becomes privileged and who is marginalized by those communities. So who gets the privilege of being there, being at the table as a student, and maybe who doesn't. The next point about why identity. This is really about how one recognizes themselves. So an understanding of self, I think, is really fundamental, not only for our students who are moving through 2 years, 4 years or more, but also within ourselves, recognizing the privileges that we come to this work with, as well as the privileges, as well as marginalizations that our students come with. And really getting to whether students see themselves like truly inside as a person who is the type of person that goes to college, or the type of person who can become that scientist or become that teacher. So really investigating what we mean by having an identity, and then the identities that make up who we are. The final thing that I have on, why identity is really key to the work we do is because this is how others within the culture recognize an individual. So students can come in and they may or may not be recognized by their peers, by their faculty, by staff, as the kind of people that should be on college campuses or should be in particular programs. Um, and they may become isolated or, brought into the fold based on the identities that individuals believe they hold. So identity really gives us the opportunity to examine the cultures that are really happening in our classrooms and also at our institutions. And therefore, if we can recognize those cultures and if they aren't inclusive, we can try to shift those cultures. So the crux of what I'm looking at here and what I look at in my work kind of as a whole is intersecting identities. So we're going to talk a lot today about identity, but also about how identities come together or intersect. So I like this picture here because this really starts to break down what I mean by identities and intersecting identities. So going around clockwise, starting from education, this is really what I mean by identities. So every day, each of us is coming to our job or coming to college with all of these different experiences and different identities that can really shift the way that we not only see ourselves, but the way that we interact with each other in the college environment. So the first thing is education. So thinking about, is this student first gen? Did their parents go to college? Are they familiar with the community college setting, but maybe not the four-year setting? Then moving around clockwise, sexuality, who a person is attracted to, do they identify, with the LGBT community? Ability, is this student coming with an identity of, of being a person with a disability, physical or otherwise? Moving around, age, gender, looking at ethnicity, so identity around certain customs or cultures or traditions. Maybe they have a very strong identity in terms of language and they're very proud to be multilingual, or in terms of class or race. Each of these identities that people are coming with are really important and salient to the way that they interact with their college campus. So you can't necessarily have one of these identities or maybe two. Maybe you're coming with many of these identities and all of them are coming together to intersect to make a very unique individual. So in terms of why an intersectional approach is important to the work that we do, is it's really a holistic approach to building identity and a holistic approach really to student success. We see that identities don't exist in a vacuum. So we don't necessarily have students coming in, and they're coming in and they'll always be, X, Y, or Z. They'll always be, a Black student, or they will always be a woman, or they will always be first gen. But maybe they are Black women who are first gen, and that can look very different than perhaps a Black woman who is not first gen, or a Black woman with a disability. And we really have to think about student success in terms of the whole student rather than trying to say that students are, one identity or the other. They're actually an intersection of multiple identities. An intersectional approach also helps to avoid oversimplifying or essentializing students. The last thing that we want to do is pretend that students aren't complex, so that we can understand students fully just through one particular identity. I think that runs the risk of not being able to serve our students in a meaningful way. The third point I have here is that identities interact and intertwine to form new and unique experiences. And really, the kind of flip side of that is the last point is that these unique experiences are oftentimes the results of multiple and different types of oppression that are coming together. So what I mean by that is, for instance, if you are a woman in STEM, let's say you're a Latina in STEM, you are bringing your Latina identity, you're bringing your identity as a woman, and you're bringing your identity as a woman in STEM. So you're bringing all of these things with you into the STEM context. And it isn't necessarily that you will not be a woman in STEM or not be a Latina in STEM. You are at all times a Latina in STEM, a Latina woman in STEM. And therefore, you have these intersections that you're bringing with you. So you may experience racism as well as sexism in a very different way, perhaps, than other women. So why is an intersectional approach needed, specifically in higher ed? I think that the first thing to think about here is that we're in charge of shaping tomorrow's leadership. The people who are coming through our doors, these are people that are going to need to understand how to engage with the tensions of identity, how to interact with people that are different from them, or people that are sharing different cultural norms perhaps than them. And so we have to be the ones to address the fact that people are beautiful and holistic in all of their complexity. The second reason that we really need this approach in higher ed is because this really starts to break down the way that we think about diversity and power and inequity. Thinking about identity and starting to question who is in the room and who is experiencing what form of oppression can really start to get your mind working about who gets to be privileged and in those settings and who is not there, and whose perspective is being left out. And this can really help us push towards, more equitable experiences at the individual, the classroom, the campus level, and hopefully at the national level, so that students of color or women, depending on what context we're talking about, that students are experiencing the educational system in a more equitable way. And finally, the reason that we need this is to really push towards inclusive excellence. So some of you may have heard this term, it's been floating around for a while, but basically this term is about shifting that responsibility for advancing diversity away from a single person or an office and really getting it across campus. As I'm sure many of you know and have experienced, sometimes there is a person on campus that, diversity is their thing, or there's someone who's leading an effort and it's kind of their thing, but really shifting our paradigm away from, this is the multicultural students office deal. This is, something that is waiting for the diversity officer to do. Really, we should all be pushing towards this sort of inclusive excellence, no matter what field students are in, no matter what office we're talking about. The move towards inclusive excellence should really be the shared responsibility of everyone across campus. So what this looks like in process and in practice, because we can talk about these intersectional identities, but really until you start looking at students and what they're bringing with them, it doesn't become real, I don't think. So I had used the suggestion of a Latina woman in STEM earlier, and we see here, and this is, I feel like it could be any student, at our campuses. This is a Latina woman in STEM. So together and intersectionally, she has many different identities. So She is a part of the Latino community and may have certain cultures and norms around being part of the Latino community. She is also a woman, so there are certain stereotypes that women that we absolutely encounter, particularly in the STEM fields. We also see that in this example, she is a veteran and a post-traditional student. So she, is balancing work and life and, coming back into the college setting. And all four of these identities are really going to influence the way that perhaps that she deals with financial aid, or the way that she interacts with peers in her class or forms friendships outside of class. All of these identities are going to factor into the kind of student experience that she's having. Looking at it in terms of a different student, we see that this might look like a Latino male in an English field, for instance. He not only is a part of the Latino community, he is a man, and in terms of being a Latino man, may deal with issues of machismo, may deal with issues of, feeling like you have to be the provider. And this is coming from research that I and others have done. But that also might be complicated by the fact that he identifies as a gay man with a disability. So together, he is bringing all of these different identities into play when he's coming on our campus. And so we have to be ready as educators, not only to address the fact that he's a Latino man, but also to be able to serve the needs of him as a student with a disability, or as a gay man coming into the community college or the four-year setting. And we have to be, as practitioners, ready to deal with that and ready to honor those identities that make this student unique. So the second part of what I have here is considering intersecting identities to create more equitable education outcomes. So this is really trying to get down to it. So I'm going to ask you and challenge you in this sort of area to really dig a little deeper. First of all, in a self-study, so thinking about how you've experienced your own life and your own education, because one of the best ways to think about identity is to first be really reflective of ourselves. And then the second part of this is looking at the individual level and then the institutional level to understand how you are interacting with others in terms of identity. So go ahead, and if you don't already, get something to write with, get comfortable, and I want you to think about some of these questions. And I know that I need to end fairly quickly, so I would definitely encourage you to, really come back to this. I'm sure that we can get you these slides, but to definitely think about the privileges and the identities that you hold. So in terms of a self-study, like really thinking about what identities, in this circular set of identities, like what identities do you hold? And then thinking about how these identities influenced your journey. So was it important that you were first gen? Was it important that you were Spanish speaking, or that you were a woman, or that you had a disability? And then also think about what privileges you were afforded because of those identities. And then maybe what challenges you had to overcome based on those identities. And so I'm going to go ahead and move forward, but I encourage you to really think for yourself about the identities that you hold and really the experiences that you've had. On an individual level, I think the next thing to this sort of self-discovery about identities and the work that we do is thinking about how intersecting identities influence a student's experience. So first, thinking about yourself and the identities that you hold, the privileges and the oppressions perhaps that you have had, but also thinking about the intersecting identities that your students have. So we all are serving students. Think about your favorite student, or think about maybe the problem student, who at the same time is always my favorite student. Thinking about the identities that that student is bringing with them onto campus, and how those identities are going to influence the experience that they've had. And then digging a little bit deeper to really challenge yourself to think about what you as an educator are doing. What are you doing to make sure that the educational environments that you have control over, because we all have an area that we can control, what kind of environments are you creating? And what can we really do in our sphere of influence to make sure that those environments are inclusive of multiple intersecting identities? And then the last kind of area here that I would encourage you to think about is really what your campuses are doing in terms of context for intersectional identities. So does your campus, does your institution honor intersectional identities? And if the answer is yes, excellent. That is beautiful. If the answer maybe is, I don't know, or maybe, or we could, think about, what you can do at your own institution, and what the institution as a whole can really do to be more inclusive of students' multiple and intersecting identities. And I know I got to wrap up. I'm sure Lydia's like, please stop. So just some final thoughts, and I won't go through all of these, but I wanted to say that when we're thinking about identities, there's no silver bullet for what we're trying to do here. This is really about examining your own practice, listening not only to your students, but to each other, and then trying to practice that inclusivity, on a local level, on a larger classroom level, and then finally institution or state or national level. And really considering the choices that we make when you're sitting around the table, making policy decisions, making classroom decisions, thinking about the various identities that these students are coming with, and how the policies and the choices that we're making and the structural things that we're doing influence the experiences for students who hold those identities. Specifically for my faculty or instructors, I wanted to put in a slide that was specifically about teaching inclusively. I think that this is some really great things that you can do to start pushing towards inclusivity and really honoring those identities, those multiple and intersecting identities. So trying to incorporate diversity into your curriculum and making space for sharing multiple perspectives. So I know one of the questions I always get is STEM faculty are like, how am I supposed to do that? Like I teach calculus, I teach this, I teach that, it's just content. But there is room for the kinds of examples that you give, varying the kinds of examples that you give, varying the approaches that you have. So really pushing towards universal design, giving students an opportunity to express themselves and to be recognized in multiple modes of learning, not necessarily just through one type of learning, but giving a broad range. And very much being proactive with trying to learn about your students, and have a feedback loop open so that they feel as though they can bring their whole selves to class or to the institution, not just a part of their identity. Finally, you're going to make mistakes. It's going to be difficult. Part of being in this game is, challenging the system over time and being willing to wait out the change and shift the change over time. So even though we can't do all of this work necessarily overnight, I think this is work that we need to continue pressing for. I've also put a bunch of resources on here if you are interested in this. Also some of my work, some really great resources to check out are Crenshaw, Hooks, these are kind of fundamental looks at the intersecting identities that people have. And then, of course, I have some of my work as well. Most of my work focuses on Latinas in STEM. So, understanding how culture and gender kind of come together. And then also in terms of Latino men and masculinities coming to campus. So if you have any questions, I'm more than excited to take those questions. And if you have anything that you would ever like to reach out, my contact information is here. I'm more than happy to be a resource and to help in any way I can.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And your timing is perfect. No worries at all. This is great.
Perfect.
Yeah. So,
I wanted to say thank you, if I may,
mhm.
Sarah, for joining us. This has been a very insightful and fascinating conversation, or at least the start of a conversation. Um, it has been our pleasure to have you as one of our peer mentors. So, first of all, thank you for that, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. Um, I was going to say that you're a very rare individual, and that you have worked with many of our former partners. You have worked with the Dana Center, and of course, you know that we have been partnering with them with regards to our Education 1300 course. And now we're trying to do math as well. So that links us to them a little bit more. Also, you have worked with our dear friend Victor Science at UT Austin, the Mail Project, and of course the Center for Community College Student Engagement. Even though they're not our partners, all of our colleges have worked with them. So you really bring an insight that is really valuable to us, and that we hope to capitalize on, not just today, but as we move forward. Because I think you can give us a lot of guidance as to how we may best take some of the principles that they instill into our own work. Um, so, one of the things that I wanted to ask about was with regards to inclusiveness versus alienation. And I'm thinking about some of the conversations that I often have with my colleagues over here at Yale regarding access. And oftentimes people say, well, you provided access, so you did your part. And of course, we know that's not enough. And of course, institutions try to have programs or courses and things to be able to address that. However, we still have students that take a while before they feel like they belong. So that process of not feeling alienated uh, is kind of hard to determine, how long it's going to take. From all the opportunities that you've had to work with these various programs over in the past, what recommendations do you have for us to bring about a sense of belonging to our students when the process seems to be delaying them?
Yeah, the very first thing that comes to mind is my work on looking at Latino men. So specifically, thinking about Latino men coming to community colleges for the first time, and thinking about the fact that for many of the men that I've worked with in my studies, community colleges are the first positive educational experiences that they may have had. They may have had issues in terms of, discipline, or issues in terms of marginalization in high school or before, with teachers not connecting with them, or, staff that didn't necessarily believe that they belonged in those areas. So something that came out of that particular work was making sure to normalize the feeling of newness. Something that the men in our study expressed was the fact that everyone else seemed like they knew, that they knew what was going on, that they knew where the resources were, and they don't. They absolutely don't. So trying to normalize the process of accessing resources and building that in to, whether it be to the curriculum, whether that be building it into, student, not orientation, because I have mixed feelings about orientations, but building it into the process, that you have to access those resources, so that students, particularly men of color, but students will believe that this is a part of their process, and this is a part of being a college student and coming to campus. I think something else in terms of sense of belonging and thinking about intersecting identities, is really thinking about when we create space in our classes, um, listening. I think that we don't talk enough about just listening to understand versus listening to react. And, I think we get caught up so much in terms of classrooms or advising, that we aren't listening to our students necessarily. So really being cognizant that you are listening to their story, that you're listening to, the things that students are bringing with them.
That's great advice. Thank you. Um, I think that's
And
a
I
great
think
thing to
structure,
do.
yeah, and I also, and that's just on an individual level. And I also want to put a plug in terms of structurally. I think that living learning communities, of course, are really a great thing. If you're talking about community college learning courses, also in terms of, pairing courses, I think is definitely a way to increase sense of belonging as well. So, creating classes, like a frameworks class, or, creating these co-requisites, that not only allow students to have, a foundation that goes along with certain courses that they're taking, but in many cases, a co-requisite can also mean that you're building a community of students who are moving through that pipeline together.
Excellent, because that really supports our work with familias in the classroom, the peer groups
Mm-hmm.
that we have. In exactly right now, we're talking about how we prepare those other teachers in other courses that would pair up with our own classes. So this is very timely for you to say that, because those are exactly the kind of issues that we're trying to address. So we'll definitely take that into account. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. We're honored. Lydia, I'll send it back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think this is great. I think in particular, the question of belonging and how we can demonstrate that our institutions are welcoming and inclusive of all students, but particularly those who have traditionally felt excluded or have that kind of experience of imposter syndrome. Earlier this academic year, we had another webinar about imposter syndrome. And I think your
Mm-hmm.
point about normalizing a novice mentality, I think that's something that can even be carried into the workplace, right? And is something that can even have an impact on students. So I wanted to piggyback on that idea, as well as what you just said about sort of learning framework style classes. One of the trends I've seen recently in higher education, it's a twofold trend. One is about, the major point is about teaching resilience. And so it's been sort of grit, right? Teaching grit in learning frameworks or student success type classes. And now I'm seeing more of a push toward teaching resilience, and even institutions of higher education offering badges of resilience for resilience when students complete this coursework that they can put on their LinkedIn profiles. And it's something that employers now are looking at.
I'm of two minds about this question of resilience. On the one hand, I know from some of our other scholar mentors like Laura Rendon and Amaury Nora have done work that suggests that many first generation and Latino students, for instance, already exhibit resilience because of their prior experiences. And so to me, it seems a little bit patronizing to then say, we need to teach you resilience. It's a way of invalidating their prior experiences to me. But then I also have a criticism of this teaching resilience that's a similar kind of criticism that the grit curriculum has received, which is that it seems to risk putting the onus for inclusion and diversity and belonging on the student or on the new employee rather than on the institution. So I just wonder if you could speak to how you see kind of, intersectionality and identity relating to this new trend, and, whether you think it's worthwhile to incorporate this teaching of resilience into our curricula. And if so, how can we do it in a way that is mindful of our students' intersectional identities?
Yeah, man, why'd you have to
It's a
give me
really long
a
question.
yeah, why'd you have to give me one that I'm going to be negative about? No. So how do I say this? I think focusing on grit and resilience, as you mentioned, does shift the onus to our students. So I'll start with the positives. So yes, I absolutely agree. I do a little coping work as well. So I study coping in Latino students as well. So how they're, coming to overcome issues. I mean, we all have challenges. That's a part of living. So I do a little bit of work there, in terms of coping. And I understand the basis for wanting to, push resilience and push grit. And that's something that, is important to being a developing, functioning adult. However, that definitely shifts the onus, onto students. And really, we're trying to get away from deficit. I don't understand why, if we're trying to get away from deficit, then we would want to teach people to deal with grit and resilience. Shouldn't we be inspiring people to shift the system? I think that this is teaching students, teaching individuals to conform within the system in order to make it. And to me, that's not inspiring. That's not transformational at all. It's practical, which is good, but it's not transformational. And that's, in the long run, not going to help. I would say that the badges, I also want to address the badges issue. So I used to do a little work in career services, and, they were talking about badges and LinkedIn and, how employers feel about badges. And I understand that this kind of gets to the millennial, and I am a millennial myself. I understand that this gets to the millennial love of, like, acquiring things and, saying good job and I did it and, checking off a thing. But at the end of the day, like, what does that badge actually mean? Do we have grit standards? Do we have resilience standards? I do not subscribe to that. And I would not say that if we look at it developmentally, that's really not probably a good thing to do developmentally in terms of college student development and how people are progressing, because that doesn't move our students towards self-authorship. It doesn't move our students really towards anything but persisting within a system that is continuously not made for them, rather than shifting that system to not be racist or not be sexist, or whatever it may be. So yeah, I don't buy
it. Thank you. No, thank you for your candor.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that in a certain sense, teaching resilience to a point can be empowering to students. And it
yeah.
And I was just going to say, and I think it's also, maybe it's more empowering even to the instructor, because it can be a way for us to be critical of our own identity lenses, right? To say, like, listen, this is the way the world is. You know, if you want to be successful in it right now, at first, be aware of this and think about some strategies, yes, that you can use to cope with racism or sexism that you might face in the workplace. But also, right, that we have to go beyond that to, you know, how are you going to author your own story? How are you going to be empowered to speak truth to power or to confront, you know, these elements, these systemic elements, that such that you can transform them instead of persisting, living with them.
Yeah, and I think that really, if that was something we were going to do, we would really need to focus on skilled facilitation. So, like you mentioned, like the people that are rolling out these concepts, these ideas, if this is happening in framework classes or FYE classes or something, a significant amount of self-study would have to be done for the people doing the facilitation. And I'm not quite sure that that would roll out the way necessarily that we wanted it to roll out. It could be quite dangerous, I think. Something that I completely forgot that I did want to say before we moved on or whatnot is thinking about shifting the resilience talk or the grit talk to thinking about self-efficacy and how we can inspire students to have more efficacy around their ability to be successful or their ability to do something, I think is also important and perhaps maybe more important than trying to look at grit. If you look at like social cognitive career theory and persisting people, you know, across time, it's really about the efficacy that is enabling people to move from, you know, one thing to another, or from, you know, not having a college going identity to, you know, becoming a scientist or whatever it may be. And perhaps a better conversation is around efficacy.
I love that. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions from our attendees, or would anybody like to jump in and think about some of the questions that Sarah posed to us in terms of our instruction and how we create inclusive educational spaces or inclusive educational environments in our classrooms, at our institutions? Remember, you can type a question or you can use the hand raise feature if you have audio, and I will unmute you so that you can talk to Dr. Rodriguez yourself.
While people are writing, I actually had a little follow-up question on your comment regarding being a pragmatist versus being transformational. And you talked about coping. And I know that for our teachers in particular, you know, there are times that they have to be very pragmatic and they follow whatever the institution has designed to be able to address, you know, certain issues of, you know, making students feel included. So that they're basically somewhat restricted. So how can they push to bring about positive change? You know, where does one find that balance between pragmatism um, and you know, getting to a transformational stage, not just institutionally but individually, you know, considering your comments regarding self-efficacy?
Yeah, and I think this is really, I think the greatest area of research, at least in STEM right now, and looking at shifting STEM cultures, which is the work that I'm doing right now, is really thinking about, you know, how do you be of this, how do you be in the system but not of the system? You know, I think the first step to that is you have to become well versed and educated in the area that you are very passionate about. So, for instance, if you are very interested in, you know, making inclusive environments and, you know, thinking about intersections of identity, then you need to be really not, well, you need to be well read in that area, and also having data, to back that up, and, something beyond. I think our gut feelings are important, but at the end of the day, shifting ideas requires us to be well read and well versed in a particular area. And then also, having examples, being able to point to data that says this is causing an issue here, or this is correlated with this. Having a way to substantiate your point and being well versed in the particular area, I think, is kind of a first step. So if you're interested in identity, going out and reading about identity, understanding identity, like taking it to heart and thinking about, your own identities, so the self studies. And then I think the next, kind of moving up step to doing that, is really finding a way to navigate the settings that you're in. So in terms of me, I am not a confrontational human being. That is not the way I live my life at all. So I try to ask good questions, and that's a very kind of baby step to be able to kind of get you in that space. So asking, well, what sort of influence do you think this will have on our first gen students? Or, why did we choose to have this person, this session be led by a man rather than a woman? Or did we consider, our, LGBT students who are also Latino students? Did we consider that? So learning how to ask good questions in those settings, I think, helps you find your voice as a leader. And then sort of the next step of that is not being afraid to kind of stand up for your stand on the table issues. I had a wise mentor once that said, pick 2 or 3 issues that are going to be your issues, and have them be stand on the table issues. So if inclusivity and identity is your stand on the table issue, then, stand on the table for that issue, and maybe other issues, maybe not so much, but really having the wherewithal to stand on the table for your particular issue. And then the last thing is about self-care. And I don't think that people talk enough about self-care, particularly for those of you who are in the trenches, actually working with students day in and day out, and doing the heavy lifting of this work to shift change, and thinking about what ways that you can be good to yourself, and nurture your soul through this whole shifting of cultures, or shifting of change, and really not letting battle fatigue get to you, and making sure that you're self-caring, particularly with other colleagues.
That's great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Dr. Chavez and I will clap for you.
We need to be with her more often, so we don't take the whole time. This is very, very insightful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And yes, it's been a brilliant presentation that has led to a really robust question and answer session, I think, as well. So Sarah, thank you for your time. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And I want to echo Dr. Chavez's thanks for, your sort of centrality in a lot of the different circles that we are moving in as well. So hopefully we'll get to continue working together in the future.
Absolutely. And again, if I can be of any help to anyone, please let me know.
Oh, thank you. We will. Definitely.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Sarah.
Okay, well, I'm going to attempt to get off of this, and so,
Sure.
so that y'all can do your
screen. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good
Bye.
afternoon.
You too.